Hi everyone, welcome to the Art Workshop. My name is Christopher Epling. We really appreciate you tuning in today. Today we have a very special episode in store for you. We're going to be doing something a little different today. If you follow along at home, we would love to see what you create. You can send that to us by using our email address. It's piketv99@gmail.com. If you're interested in seeing some of the past shows we've worked on, we've done quite a few of the Art Workshops, so that's really easy too. Jump over to our YouTube channel. There's all kinds of resources on there for you, and you'll see for everything from basic drawing with graphite to watercolor to going into even, I think one episode we even used some Copic markers as a airbrush, which was really interesting. So please check that out if you get time. Now in today's episode we have something really special in store. So I thought we're going to be moving now, as of the recording of this episode at least, into fall. We're getting ready to jump over. Still summer. It's still really hot out, but you can see the leaves are starting to change. And anytime there's changes in season, I always kind of go back to drawing these nature scenes for some reason. But instead of using plain white paper today, we're going to be using what's called tone paper. Tone paper is just an offset color of like a tan. And the reason artists use this is because you can use different types of medium with it, in colors with it, and you get a different effect that you really can't really get with plain white paper. And I'll show you more about what I mean by that here just in a second. Today we're going to focus on, like I said, nature scene, so I thought we'll do a running brook. You can find many of these beautiful brooks in areas along the riverbanks here in eastern Kentucky, especially if you venture out into Elkhorn City, you go out into the Breaks area, some of the state parks that are around. You can really find some nice trails and run across some of these beautiful, just ideal scenes of nature. And hopefully what we draw today will be one of those representations of one of these little spots you can find just going on a simple hike. Now tone paper, as I said, now this is a type of tone paper called Canson. It's a 400 series. I put a little smudge of white so you can see there. So typically when you're using white paper, you're not able to really get the effect of a white pen on that paper. It just blends right in. The materials I'm going to be using today, you don't necessarily need all of these to draw at home. I brought a few different types of charcoal pencils in. So this is a white charcoal. This is General's Charcoal White. It's a 558 series, and what that means is just what the classification that the manufacturers give these pencils. So if you're into charcoal and you've never used it before, it's really neat to start out using a tone paper with some of these white pencils. Now all these are the same. There's no difference in the tone. So with some pencils you may have a B or an HB or a 2B. This is all the same. It's just one basic medium. I'm also going to be using what you see here is a graphite pencil. This is a charcoal pencil. It can be erased using an eraser, and I've brought an eraser with me. I've also brought in a couple examples of using ink on tone paper. This is a gel pen here. You can find these just about any office supply store. And then also this is a brush pen with white ink in it. Now this is something a little more specialized. You may have to go to a hobby store to find that. I also brought in a mechanical pencil if I need it, and then I brought in a few ink pens and brushes that I can use to add in the dark tones later on. And I even brought in a couple of these washes, which is just basically an alcohol-based marker that has a different tone of gray in each one. So that's really nice when you're using tone paper to add this gray effect on there to give depth and shadow. Now in today's drawing, I don't want you to follow along with this in particular. Just kind of watch for a second and let me explain something, what we're going to be doing. Now the first thing I'm going to do is place my example up here so I can see it, because I'm going to be drawing from an actual previous drawing. What you're going to be seeing today is something like this. You're going to be working with depth in a drawing. So when we start out, you can think of, like I've done before, I've shown you this before, we have our line of, this is our horizon line with perspective. So we always need to establish that horizon line when we're working with art, because that tells us where exactly the middle of the drawing is, at least when you're talking vertically. Now when we look at this drawing, there's going to be a few different elements. You're going to see one large structure about this location in the drawing, and then you're going to see some different elements back here on this portion of the drawing, and then you're also going to see another structure here. And the reason I'm sketching this out first is I want you to see the layout of the composition of the drawing before we ever start. So this is going to be a nature scene, so water is going to be coming down, falling off from these rocks here, and this of course is water here. Behind it, way off into the distance, we're going to see a little bit of foliage from some trees. So I'll just put this in for now as a placeholder so you can see. So this is the composition of our drawing today. Once we go in and we actually start to add shadow and we start to add a lot of depth into the different rocks and maybe in between some of the rocks back here where the water is flowing, some rocks maybe in the water. Once we start to do that, you're going to see that the depth and perspective comes to life. And you really get this by planning out first your composition. Now while this is not at all the finished drawing and nowhere near it, I can see when I look at this that this is farther off than this. So this is closest to me. It's going to appear larger. Things off into the foreground as you go into the background are going to appear smaller. This is just a rule of thumb when you're drawing. And you get this by establishing this horizon line first thing and then moving from there. So go ahead and get your pencil and paper ready. I'm going to flip this over. No use wasting paper. We can use the back part of it just as well. And we're going to now start with today's exercise. This paper kind of blends in a little bit with the table, but you can still see it pretty good. So let's start off, take your pencil, and let's establish that horizon line again. And I'm going to push this a little lighter. I'm not going to push down so hard with this one. I'm going to eventually probably erase this line or most of it. But I'm going to draw it heavy enough so you can kind of see it at least. So start out with just drawing a line across your paper. Once you've done that, you want to start with the closest thing to you. So we're going to put a rock about right here. So just draw kind of a shape that is similar to what you would imagine an oval, but you have some, of course, some ridges here. So you have some sharp angles that appear. We have another rock that's setting off into the background. And this reminds me a lot of when kayak season in the breaks. So when you go, if you ever go up into Elkhorn City and out into the breaks area, the water, when it's low at least, in some areas, you can see these rocks protruding up from the riverbank. And whenever, of course, during kayak season, this water is a lot more heavier, and all these rocks are under the water, which causes the rapids. So what we're seeing now is basically what's underneath the water that causes those huge ripples and different types of rapids. So I've added a few different shapes here. I've got this rock and a couple here. You could put a couple more kind of just setting along the side here. The bank of the river, we'll imagine it to be over here on this side to the right. So add a few of these, just a couple circles, jagged ovals, some bigger than others, some smaller. We want to fill this space up though with some of these rocks. And as you get closer to the middle of the drawing, which is about right here, of course, we want to slow down and not use as many of these rocks because this is where water is. Now let's jump over to the left side, and I want to add a couple here, not as many, just a few. What happens is when you lay a lot of content on one portion of your drawing, you balance it out usually by somewhere else putting something as heavy. So I've put a lot of stuff here for my composition. I want to put a lot of stuff up here. I could have chose to put a lot here or here, but to balance this out nice, I want it to be going from the top corner to the bottom corner. So I have a couple rocks here. Now let's go ahead and put a line coming in towards the middle of our drawing and then bring it straight up towards the corner there. And what we've done is establish sort of a rock ledge coming down to the water here. And we want another one, but this one's going to start back a little bit further and go back towards the waterfall, about right there. Now, working upwards, I'm going to go in between this shape and this shape. This line separates them. I'm going to start about right here, and I'm going to bring a line coming up, in. Remember to put some of these angles, these different jagged shapes, because that really helps to establish that the material we're working with is rock, so it really helps to establish to the person who's looking at your work that this is jagged. Go over to the side to the right, and let's draw a line coming down this way now towards these rocks that we've placed in here, something like that. We'll work more on the right side by putting a line coming up. Bring the lines in, move them out, just make a lot of jagged shapes all the way up here to the top. Now the trees that we see that I showed you earlier in our preliminary sketch, those trees are going to appear, at least the tops of them, up here. So we really can't see anything over this rock, and we can't see anything over this rock. This frames the drawing, and this large element here is going to be balanced now by what we put here. So starting about right there on your paper, come out, and now we're going to establish the rocks that come down, forming the water that's coming down, falling over top of them. Put a few jagged shapes coming up and down, and then of course some more rocks forming here towards the top. This is where the water's coming down, and I'll sketch kind of a few lines to help show where the water's falling, at least for now. We want to put that in white, so let's leave this kind of open right here. So the water's coming down, of course it's pooling up. We have the rocks here, we have our large formation of the walls here. We want to now kind of put detail in. We've drawn basic big lines, which is great, but bring some of these shapes in and start to place a few of these different lines and blocks that kind of block out where the rocks, you can see underneath some of them. Some of them are maybe broken off into the water. All along the back side, moving down this way, we're going to have more shadow. So I'm placing a line coming up, separating this from here, and then over here we're going to come down and we're going to draw some more of these broken lines, just stemming out from the water, coming up from the river. You want to draw a few of these. The more you add, the more detail you give yourself, but you also have more to color in and shade in later. So keep that in mind as you're working. All right, so we've placed a few of these little jagged lines here and there. That should work for that. And now we want a few here. Maybe just put a few shapes like triangles. You could put a few rectangles in here, because these will all be shadowed once we're finished. All this area will be shaded in. Now we got to form where the light's coming from. We always do that when we're working with our composition, and for the purpose of this drawing, the light is really kind of coming in this way, moving towards the water. So if that's the case, then everything behind the light's going to be darker. So I'm coming back up to the top now. I'm going to put a little bit of some foliage sticking up here. We don't want to put a lot of detail in there. We just kind of want the viewer, or at least the person looking at your work, to see that this is breaking off now into something else, right? All of this we'll leave open. We won't worry about it. Now, since we've established all of the composition pretty much, we still need to put detail in, we can now start with our shadow. So moving up here towards the top, let's go ahead and put this heavy coat of graphite down all along this line that I created, and you should have created too, going up the side of this rock formation, all the way up the side of it here. You can bring it up into the other part of it if you want. And what we're doing now is I'm turning my pencil to the side a little bit, so you don't need a graphite pencil. You can use number 2 pencil and turn it to the side. You may have to sharpen it a few times, but I'm turning it to the side, and I'm basically wanting to get this nice kind of even application of this graphite all around these corners, going down here to the rock. Of course, this rock here, put a little bit in between. The light's coming in from this way, but you can still, though, with rock, if you notice and took time to look at nature, you see a lot of shadows forming in these crevices and different types of outputs that break open in the rock. So while this is one large giant wall of rock, we have a whole lot of different little tiny details in the texture, maybe where, you know, light can get in and where it can't. So this is the same effect now we want to put on this side. We want to keep in mind where our light's coming from at all times. This line coming down that I ask you to draw behind this one, we can go ahead and put a lot of dark tone in there. This is going to be where the light is probably obscured the most. So it's all along this area. And by adding these little shades and different types of applications of this graphite this way, you can really make the viewer believe that they're looking at something that has depth to it. They believe that, you know, there's light coming off this. There's definitely different elements at play here. We have the water, we have the walls of rock coming down, forming the river, and then we also have the rocks that are setting sort of off to themselves. Maybe it's broken off or been washed down. Back in your background, you want to make sure this area is nice and darkened in, because the white coming off of the rocks, the water here in a minute, the more shadow that we have, the more that white is going to pop out. Now some of these angles that you've drawn, be sure, go back over and add a little bit of shadow in those. This formation is probably receiving the most light coming in of course, from this angle. So we don't want to put a whole lot of shadow here, but we still want to add some, because like I said earlier, there's a lot of different textures here going on. Different angles and things to obscure light, and texture too. The rock has its own texture. Even one rock will have a different type of formation to it than others. One may be very smooth, one might be broken off, one might be jagged, sharp. It's a whole gambit of different styles that you can pull in here to get this effect. Now this rock that's closest to us, we just want to put a little bit of shadow around the bottom of it, like that. And then of course up from the bottom here, and let's go ahead and put some shadow on the riverbank, because these rocks that are forming up the riverbank are of course casting their own shadow behind them. So we want to make sure and put some of those in there. And then what you can do is, after you've put this really dark tone down, go back over it with your pencil again, and then really lightly, this is not pressing down very hard at all, put a few more shadows in. And so this kind of tells the eye that there's still breaks and different divots in the rock, but apparently these aren't as deep as some of the others that are more obscured by the light. We can even darken those areas in more as you need it. And as you're drawing, you will be able to tell as you're working what you need to do more of, less of, and really the composition that we formed at the very beginning helps to really rule the entire flow of how you apply your medium. And by medium, we're just talking about what we're drawing with. So your medium could be crayons, they could be watercolor, so on and so forth. Whatever you're using to create your work with, that's your medium. And for the purpose of this drawing, our medium is graphite and white ink. Maybe a little bit some of those alcohol-based markers in a little bit. Go up the side, put a little more gray, maybe the tops of these rocks. This one here, we can put a little more detail in there. And you can keep working with this forever. And we could, of course, do that now, but we want to be aware of time. So at this point, I'm going to focus on the water. The water has shadow to it as well. So there's shadow being cast from the rocks beside it, and then also the depth of the water will help to add shadow. There's also light being reflected at the very same time. So while there's shadow here being reflected from these huge rock formations, we also have light that's bouncing off of these. And so the water is a little tricky. You want to just put sporadic little lines of shadow leading up to these rocks in the foreground. You don't want to put a lot, but maybe just a few lines like this, and it helps to kind of give the idea that there's water coming down. Now, the part I've been waiting on, we want to first start out with our white. So you take your charcoal white and start at the top up here, and the water is going to be coming down, going across the rocks. So we're going to see some shadow in here, so it's not all going to be obscured. We're going to see some shadow forming, especially underneath where the water is coming down. What I'm doing first is just getting a coat of white at the top, nice solid form, and then I'm coming down and bringing these lines down towards this bottom portion here. And you may put a few splashes of white popping up for where the water is kind of splashing off where it's hitting against the rocks, bringing it down here to the bottom. Of course, where the water is pulling up and splashing, we want to add quite a bit of white here. Now, if you're really, really conservative with how much white you use in a drawing like this, the areas that you do color in white will appear a lot more intense because this color isn't being used anywhere else on the drawing. For the purpose of our drawing, we're going to put a little bit of white out here in various areas, but for the most part, all of our white's going to be focused in right here. Once you get a coat of white sort of like that, heavy at the top, lines coming down, and heavy at the bottom, you can take your graphite again, and this time go in between the white areas that you've placed there and put a little bit of shadow, because we have rock that's actually behind this water. It's not all water, so we want a little bit of shadow popping in and out there. Not a lot, but a little bit. Maybe right in the middle too, just a little bit like that. Not a whole lot, but as you're doing this, you can see if you put a lot of heavy shadows around the white starts to even pop out even more. Towards the top up here, we really would like to get this part that's touching the line that's touching the white, at least the closest up here, really heavy with shadow. That'll help a lot to give that effect of this water cascading down. And this is a scene that you may find anywhere on any hike along a river here in eastern Kentucky. It's we have some of the most beautiful outdoor resources to enjoy probably anywhere in the world. So if you get time to go out during this summer leading into fall, be sure and take time to look at all the wonderful and beautiful resources that we have all around us here, just waiting to be explored and waiting to be enjoyed. I'm going to put a little bit heavier shadow towards the back leading up to the water. So that gives the effect again that this is all within this little tiny kind of cove that's formed by the river and the rocks around it. There we go. Maybe add a little bit more shadow going along this side, leading over here to the edge of the river. Of course, in between these rocks here will be nice and dark too. Now, if you really wanted to, you could get the markers out. I'll pull those out in a second. If you don't have these materials at home, it's perfectly fine. You could draw this entire scene that we did today using simply pencil and paper. So I'm going to pull first out this marker here. It's of course the ink, and it's pretty. It can come out pretty heavy. So you test it out before you ever. There we go. Start on your piece. Now with this is a lot brighter than the graphite. But the neat thing about this is it gives the white that you've applied even more intensity. So if you were to take this now and go along and just put splashes of this in various locations, it gives the idea that there's water kind of bouncing off of the rock. And you can do this all over, the areas that you place white in. You want to be a little conservative with it, but for the most part, the areas where the water might be bouncing off or splashing, this is where you want to put a little more detail. And maybe up here along this portion, maybe it's bouncing behind a rock here. You can get really, really, technical with these types of landscape drawings. And you can really get in there and start to add all this nice detail bouncing off of different shadows and shapes and surfaces. It's one of probably my most favorite thing to do when it comes to using tone paper is to do landscape drawings, because you really get these neat little effects that pop out, something like that. So the water just seems like it's just popping over these rocks and going down into the river. Now, I have a few alcohol-based brushes here. You can see this you could go back over even on top of your graphite and go in and put some more shadow along these areas that's furthest away, especially up this side of this rock face here. The thing is though, once you actually start applying this heavy, heavy shadow, you're going to have to put it across the board. So you're going to have to use it more in one location. We can't just use it in this area and then not use it anywhere else in our drawing, because it starts to stick out as being something that it's not supposed to be there, and we want it to to be there. So just in certain locations, I may take a alcohol-based marker and just kind of go over to add a little more depth in that shadow, especially along these areas back here that are most obscured. The light cannot get in there, and then even in between some of the little tiny splashes of white that I've done, I may add even more dark there. Some tones in here. Be a little conservative with it though. You don't really need this so much as you do with the heavy graphite. But you can combine mediums like this to get certain effects. Now once this dries, this will actually appear a lot less intense. It won't be as dark as it appears now. And you can offset that if it does appear a little bit maybe more dark than other areas. You can offset that by taking your pencil and then going back over it again, lightening up some areas or darkening in some areas. All right, so I'm going to put a little more detail back here. These rocks formations back in the far back. And then of course right here maybe just to balance out this medium a little bit so that it's not just one-sided. We have all these shadow formed by the graphite and then this marker just kind of sticking out in the middle of nowhere. Just a little bit here and there. Just remember the rule of thumb though, whenever you're working with light and you're trying to show the reflection of light, is go light to dark. So start out, very lightly applying your shadow by, going back and forth with your brush or your pen or pencil, and then go back over it again after you've done that, and you can darken in the areas. It's much easier always to add to than it is take away. So just a rule of thumb when you're working with light. So we have a little bit more shadow now popping in. Now this white really pops out. If you're looking at this home, you can see on your screen just how bright that is, and that's a neat effect. And we could leave it here, but just before we close today, what I'm going to do is actually go back in with the white here, and I'm going to put a little bit more light bouncing off certain areas. So you may put a little bit up here, and then we'll work on those trees at the very last. Just a little bit here and there. You don't have to put a whole lot, but where the light is probably reflecting the most, it would be nice to add a little bit more highlight in there. And this is something you don't have to do. You do not have to go back over it and add more white in certain locations. It's up to you. Especially with these rocks sort of out here closest to us, we may add a little bit here too. Landscape drawings can be very quick. They don't really necessarily have to require a ton of time to do. You don't have to spend forever on it. You can actually take your sketch pad with you on a hike and come across a little area, sit down, have some water, eat a Nutrigrain bar or an orange, and you can create something. You bring it home, and it takes a little bit longer than a picture. Maybe a little bit easier just to take a picture, sure, but when you create it and you're drawing it, you really see things in what you're looking at that you didn't see before. You see these little curves and shadows that pop out, and it makes you look at nature differently. You look at it in terms of composition, and it's really amazing to do that sometimes. There we go. I've balanced it out with a little bit more white now, and the very last detail I'm going to do is for these shades of gray where the marker is. I'm going to go in over top of it one more time, just a little bit here, put a little bit of coat of graphite along the tops of these ridges here and along the rock formations to the left and right. Well, thanks again. I hope you get out, enjoy nature a little bit. Take a sketchbook with you if you do, and share it with us what you create. Well, until next time, I'm Christopher Epling, and remember, keep drawing.